Before I start out this video, I want to issue you all a warning. This video contains a lot of spoilers, not just for the base game of Elden Ring, but also major spoilers for the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. So please, if you haven't played Shadow of the Erdtree yet, and you don't want it to get spoiled, then stop this video right now and go play the DLC and then come back. You've been warned. Well, this probably goes without saying given the topic of the video, but I am a massive fan of Elden Ring. Seriously, I absolutely love this game to death. I've managed to rack up hundreds upon hundreds of hours in this game, and I've loved absolutely all of it. For the most part, I feel like this game is the perfect example of everything I love about From Software as a game developer. Lately, however, my passion for Elden Ring as a game has been reignited following the release of the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, which was a few weeks ago as of recording this. And if I'm being honest, I think that this DLC might genuinely be the best content From Software has ever put out to date. I was originally planning on making a video where I would rank all of the DLC bosses, but then I started to think, why not do a video ranking every major boss in Elden Ring as a whole, including DLC? So that's what I decided to do. Now, for the sake of simplicity with this list, in order to qualify as a major boss for the list, the boss must give you an achievement upon killing it, drop a remembrance or important item upon death, or be important to the game in some other meaningful way. And also, just like I did in the comments section and description of the last video, I'd like to give a shout out to two other fellow content creators. Those people being Spinostation and Squidplop. I'll link their channels in the description and pinned comment below, but both of these guys genuinely make super awesome content, and I'd recommend you check them out because they are criminally underrated. Also, two things to keep in mind before we get started. For one, I am a very unapologetic Spirit Ash user, so please keep in mind that my experience might not be the same as your experience if you don't summon. And the second thing I want you to keep in mind is that this list is all just my own personal opinion. You can completely disagree with me on every single ranking, and you know what? That's completely okay. Just please try to be civil about it in the comments, people. I'll be completely honest, out of all the rankings I've made on this channel so far, this is by far the hardest ranking I've had to put together so far. Because really, Elden Ring is full of jaw-droppingly incredible fights. It was hard determining the order of all the bosses because really, in Elden Ring, there's something to like about almost every single boss. But with that said, last place was pretty easy for me. Oh god. You know it, you probably hate it. Number 47, the Valiant Gargoyles. You don't have the right. Oh, you don't have the right. Therefore, you don't have the right. Oh, you don't have the right. This boss is a combination of pretty much all of my least favorite aspects of this game. It's an extremely lazy and unbalanced gank fight with two enemies slapped down in an arena copy-paste without any consideration for how their attacks gel together or what the player might experience. They're both enemies that are already encountered way too much outside of this boss arena, and along with that, it's just a ripoff of a far better boss from Dark Souls 1. Once you enter into the boss arena, you'll almost immediately be greeted with a Valiant Gargoyle. Now, as I said, these are already encountered a good bit outside of the boss arena, but I was willing to forgive this fairly lazy decision to put it here if the fight was actually good, and well, since it's last place on the list, you can guess how good the fight actually is. First off, they barely changed anything about the gargoyles from their overworld counterparts. The only difference between these gargoyles and the ones you encounter outside of this arena, besides them having a boss health bar, is just one attack where they spray poison mist. Except this poison mist doesn't just do poison buildup. It also does damage on contact. Seriously, From Software, why? What is the point of that? Okay, so this boss is a copy-paste of two enemies already encountered a lot outside of the arena. Did they at least put fun enemies in the arena? Well, what do you think? No! The gargoyles are some of the most annoying enemies in the game, in my opinion. Seriously. They're just extremely irritating to deal with in my eyes, and I never really enjoy fighting them. The first gargoyle swaps between using a sword as well as a large axe. Although they're both technically different weapons, functionally they play out very similarly in my eyes. The only real difference from what I've noticed is that when the gargoyle has the axe out, it can do a swooping attack on you, which can be a bit dangerous. Both movesets are pretty standard for what you'd expect from these two weapons, but the gargoyle itself is very aggressive at all times, which makes it pretty annoying to deal with. But once you get the first gargoyle down to half health, the second one joins the fight, and that's when the fight goes from just being a mildly annoying and kinda lazy boss fight to the most unfair and frustrating fight in the entire game, in my opinion. The second gargoyle is pretty much the same as the first one, just with a twin blade instead of a sword. However, the thing that makes the fight so unfair is the fact that, well, both bosses are aggressive at all times and never let up once. They don't give the player any time to breathe or comprehend what's going on around them. They just keep trying to kill you constantly. The movesets do not sync up together well in a satisfying or fair way at all, and it leads to some very irritating deaths that do not feel warranted in any way. The Valiant Gargoyles were clearly not designed to work well with each other at all, so the fact that they thought this fight would even be a good idea just boggles my mind. And then, of course, there's the part that's probably very obvious by now. This boss is not original in any way, and in fact, it is a ripoff of the Bell Gargoyles from Dark Souls 1. Ironically though, they ended up being the exact opposite of what they were trying to copy, because while the Bell Gargoyles were very fair and balanced and felt like they were designed for each other, the Valiant Gargoyles are extremely unbalanced and unfair, and along with that, they just feel extremely lazy and like they weren't designed for each other at all. Pretty much anything that could have gone wrong with this fight did go wrong. Hence why I put it at number 47 on the list. Although, fair warning, the next boss on the list isn't exactly going to be a huge improvement. And now at number 46, we've got the Godskin Duo, which is probably the most infamous boss fight in all of Elden Ring. The name itself is pretty self-explanatory. Instead of fighting a unique boss, you're fighting two already existing bosses, those being the Godskin Noble and the Godskin Apostle, at the same time. And I'll be honest, this fight honestly makes me sad because I actually like both of these bosses individually, but when put together, they do not work well at all. I'm going to try to keep this section at least somewhat brief because I want to save my thoughts for each of their movesets and things like that for each of their own individual entries on the list. But, well, this fight is also very unbalanced, just like the Valiant Gargoyles. The way to take it down is at least a bit unique, though. Instead of simply killing the Godskin Apostle and the Godskin Noble, you have to kill them both, and then one of them will respawn, and you'll have to kill that one before the next one respawns, and so on. This will keep on going until you've managed to deplete their shared health bar, after which the fight is over. I like the idea they had here, but I don't think the Godskin Noble and Godskin Apostle were very good choices for this boss. I feel like they were trying to replicate Ornstein and Smough from Dark Souls 1, but that fight managed to work because of the balance of aggression as well as the balance of fast and slow attacks. Both the Godskin Apostle and the Godskin Noble are really fast bosses. And along with that, they both stay aggressive throughout the entire fight, and not just that, but the amount of time you have before the next one respawns is really tight, and it can feel pretty unfair. I'll be honest, this is one of the few bosses in the game that I do not mind cheesing at all. Seriously, this fight honestly sucks. I do not like it in the slightest. And along with everything else I've already mentioned, this boss, by default, makes the earlier encounters with the Godskin Noble and Godskin Apostle feel much less special than they did before. I'm sorry, I want to like this boss, but I just don't. I don't like it at all. Pretty much the only good thing about the Godskin duo is the music, because hey, it's pretty good. But it's not original either because it's already used for both the Godskin Apostle and the Godskin Noble. Everything I've just said is precisely why I believe the Godskin duo deserves number 46 on the list. I'll talk about each boss individually when they show up on their own spots on the list, but until then, let's move on to the next entry. Coming in at number 45, we've got Fia's Champions. Oh boy. First, you kill one NPC, then another NPC spawns in, and then you kill them, and then you fight a trio of NPCs, and then the fight's over. Look, I wish I had more to say, but I don't. I don't like NPC fights fundamentally. They tend to just feel extremely lazy and extremely uninspired. And along with that, these are Elden Ring NPCs we're talking about. The NPCs in Elden Ring are always annoying to fight. They don't seem to have any of the same restrictions the player has and can just dance around with infinite stamina and FP, which is really annoying. And one of the NPCs in this fight has a spell that creates a cloud of death blight, which is an instant kill if it fully builds up. But thankfully though, this fight is really easy because, well, all their health bars are just pitiful. I don't really have anything else to say about this fight other than it's extremely lazy, extremely underwhelming, and I don't like it at all. Hence why it earns the number 45 spot on the list. Number 44, Mohg the Omen. Now, the reason Mohg is down here in the awful tier isn't really because of the gameplay, but the reason why he's down here is because, well, he is an extremely lazy copy-paste of Mohg the Lord of Blood's first phase. And Mohg the Lord of Blood is one of my favorite base game bosses. So naturally, whenever I came across this boss at the end of the Subterranean Shunning Grounds, I groaned audibly. There was seriously no reason to repeat Mohg right here when he was already in the game as one of the main story bosses. Granted, he was optional, but so is this fight, and that's not really an excuse in my opinion. There's nothing really wrong with this fight in terms of gameplay. In fact, I think that when it comes to gameplay, the fight is really fun. I mean, it's just Mohg's first phase, so how could it not be? But I hate this fight because it takes away from how unique and cool Mohg himself is. As far as I know, the current theory on Mohg the Omen is that he's some sort of omen illusion of Mohg. Kind of similar to how Margit is an illusion of Morgott, but as far as I know, there's nothing really confirming this aside from the track's name for the song. So overall, this boss lessens one of my favorite boss fights in the game, so I can't put it any higher than number 44, even if it is good technically in terms of gameplay. Fortunately for us, however, we are now finished talking about all of the awful bosses in the game. Now we'll move on to the ones that, while they aren't good, they're not awful either. They're just bad. Number 43, Sir Gideon Ofnir the All-Knowing.
And Sir Gideon Ofnir, the All-Knowing!
Yep, another NPC boss fight makes the list, but thankfully I've got more to talk about with this one because, well, Gideon Ofnir actually has more going for him. One of the few things I like about this fight is the fact that it's an NPC fight against a character who you thought was on your side up until this moment. Gideon isn't just some sort of random NPC, he's an actual character in the game who works alongside you at the Round Table Hold, giving you a bunch of knowledge and pieces of advice such as...
Find the Albinoric woman. She hides in a cave to the west of the Laskia ruins, which jut from the mist-shrouded lake of Liurnia. She knows the location of the medallion's counterpart, I'm sure.
And then, after defeating Malekith and finding him missing at the Round Table Hold, and then going to Lane Dell and hearing his opening monologue, it was a pretty surprising moment on my first playthrough that I didn't see coming.
I knew you'd come, to stand before the Elden Ring, to become Elden Lord. What a sad state of affairs. I commend your spirit, but alas, none shall take the throne. Queen Marika has high hopes for us, that we continue to struggle. Unto eternity.
Yeah, this fight is pretty much just an instance of the whole main character has to fight a previous ally shtick, and honestly, I'm all in for it because I love that kind of melodrama. Gideon uses a wide variety of spells during his fight, and honestly, I really like that he has access to so many of them. I think it fits with him being the all-knowing and everything. Another little detail that I really like about his fight is the fact that he'll actually have more spells to use depending on which optional bosses you've killed beforehand. So for once, we actually have the foundation to make a halfway decent NPC fight. However, they completely messed it up. Want to know how they messed it up? Well, they decided to make Gideon Ofnir a very fucking annoying spammer. Like, holy shit, look at this. This guy is just obnoxious to try and fight. You might be thinking, well, why not just tank some of the damage from his magic attacks? But the thing is, he actually puts a hex on you that makes you more vulnerable to damage from spells. And when this hex is active, a lot of his attacks will hit harder than my drunken father's belt on a Friday night, so you'd better be careful. The only other noteworthy thing about this fight, really, is what Gideon says after you successfully kill him.
I know in my bones, a tarnished cannot become a lord. Not even you. A man cannot kill a god.
You might be wondering why I'm bringing this dialogue up, but the reason why is because when we kill the final boss, it ends up feeling even more satisfying because, hey, we're proving Gideon wrong. We've successfully killed a god, something he said was impossible. But overall, that doesn't take away from the fact that Sir Gideon Ofnir the All-Knowing is still a pretty bad fight, earning it the number 43 spot on the list. Number 42, the Mimic Tier. Yep, that's right, this is the third NPC fight on the list so far, but this one is at least cool on paper because instead of fighting another NPC, you're pretty much fighting an exact copy of yourself. On one hand, I really like the idea of this, and I like the idea of having to face yourself in a way. But on the other hand, I also feel a bit insulted because, well, I literally end up killing a god at the end of the game, and yet somehow I'm just as pathetic as any other NPC fight. And when I say pathetic, I mean that the majority of the encounters you'll have with the Mimic Tier will end up like this. yeah, that's pretty much everything I have to say about the Mimic tier. Moving on. And sliding right on in at number 41, we've got the Golden Hippopotamus. Out of all the bosses in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, this is the only one that I think really missed the mark. The Golden Hippopotamus is one of 4 bosses that can be found in the Shadow Keep, which is by far the best legacy dungeon in all of Elden Ring, for me anyway. But I'll save all the details of why I love the Shadow Keep for a future video. But as I was saying, while I love the Shadow Keep, the Golden Hippopotamus definitely did not give me the best first impression of the area. At first, the Golden Hippopotamus just seems like another one of the hippopotamus enemies found throughout the DLC, and it plays pretty much the exact same as a normal one during the first phase. Pretty much the only thing he has during this first phase is just a couple of bite, charge, slam, and thrashing attacks, and that's pretty much it, and they're all pretty easy to avoid and very predictable. Once the boss gets below a certain health threshold, he'll enter into Phase 2, where he takes on a new visual design, which I will admit does look pretty cool. The Golden Hippopotamus does get some new moves in Phase 2, one of them where he spews out thorns from his body, and the other where he rolls around the arena, but the thing is, that's pretty much all that changes in Phase 2. Along with that, I just feel like the arena is a bit too cramped for this boss fight, which can make it pretty annoying trying to see what's going on. With that said, I don't really find this fight to be hard or annoying or anything like that. In fact, I think it's kinda easy, if anything else. The reason I dislike the fight is just cause, well, it's kinda boring and not really all that exciting. And along with that, I just don't think that there are enough differences between this boss and the regular hippopotamus enemies to make the fight all that memorable. And I don't like that every single time I reach the Shadow Keep on a new playthrough, I have to take this boss down before I can really enter it. And so, because of everything I've just said, I believe that the Golden Hippopotamus deserves to be no higher than number 41 on the list. And now at number 40, we've got the Fire Giant. The Fire Giant is the major boss found at the top of the Mountaintops of the Giants, which is easily my least favorite open world zone in all of Elden Ring. But again, I'll save that discussion for another time. One thing I want to get out of the way is that while I do dislike the Fire Giant, and while I do think it is a bad boss fight, it's not really for the same reasons I've seen a lot of other Elden Ring players give. Unlike many bosses in Elden Ring, this boss actually has specific weak points that you have to attack in order to be able to do normal damage to it. In Phase 1, this is his wounded left leg, which is the only spot that'll take significant damage upon hitting it, so it's what you should target. My first real complaint with this fight is its difficulty, but not exactly that it's too hard. I've seen a lot of other people say that they think the Fire Giant is too hard and that it's really frustrating, but I disagree with this sentiment. In fact, if anything, I think the fight is way too easy. I know that in Phase 1, the Fire Giant has a bunch of attacks using the lid he's holding, but for the life of me, I can barely remember any of the details about them because of how easy they are to avoid. As long as you just stay close to his legs in Phase 1 and dodge his stomps and occasional fire spells, you're basically golden, and you can just avoid almost all of his melee attacks. The developers tried to counteract this strategy by making the boss able to roll away from you, but that doesn't really fix the problem since you can just as easily run back up to his legs once he's done rolling and repeat the process with minimal danger. This brings me to my next complaint with this boss, and that is that, well, the Fire Giant just feels really tedious to fight, and the fight overall just drags on a lot. Even if you only attack his weak spots, the Fire Giant still has an absolutely massive health pool, and the fight can last upwards of 10 minutes on average. I don't mind if a boss has a massive health pool, however, the Fire Giant doesn't really have all that much variety with his moveset, and given how easy it is to just avoid all of his attacks, there's nothing really going for him that justifies the fight lasting for this long, in my opinion. Once you get the Fire Giant down to half health, that's when he'll enter Phase 2, and well, he's got a pretty good Phase 2 cutscene, so go ahead and grab your popcorn, people. I will admit, for all the things that I don't like about the Fire Giant, the Phase 2 cutscene as well as Phase 2 as a whole offer up a very good spectacle in my opinion. And thankfully, in Phase 2, it actually feels like you have to fight the Fire Giant this time. Unfortunately, though, it's still not quite as difficult as many of the other bosses in the game. In Phase 2, the Fire Giant's main weak point switches from being his injured leg to being both of his wrists as well as the Eye of the Fell God that's opened on his chest. This is meant to discourage you from basically just camping underneath his legs, however, it doesn't really fix the problem because going for the rest of his body in Phase 2 is also a viable strategy because he has much less health now. While the Fire Giant has more threatening melee attacks with his arms in Phase 2, they still don't really pose all that much more of a threat than his lid smashes in Phase 1 because they're still really easy to avoid. The Fire Giant also gains a fair share of long-range as well as close-range fire attacks, which are pretty cool, and certain ones like the meteor attack he does with his fire look visually stunning. However, they're still, for the most part, pretty easy to get away from since you can just gallop away from them on torrent. In fact, in Phase 2, there's only really 2 attacks that pose a significant threat to the player. The first of the 2 is an AoE attack that the Fire Giant does while laying on his side, and when he starts it up, you have to run away as fast as possible. The second is an attack where he summons 2 Flames of the Fell God, which home in on the player and will eventually explode, but again, just run away from them. Aside from these 2 attacks, as well as an AoE attack he does very occasionally, none of his attacks really present much of a threat to the player, even in Phase 2. Overall, I just feel like this boss only really has its spectacle going for it, and aside from that, not much else. The fight isn't the worst thing in the world by any means, but it is pretty tedious and not very enjoyable, so I can't put it any higher than number 40. Number 39, Commander O'Neill. Heads up, this segment on the list might end up being on the shorter side, and I probably won't go into as much detail as some of the other bosses because Commander O'Neill is very similar to Commander Neil, who is a boss that appears much later on in the game and is, in my opinion, quite a lot better, and I'd much rather go over him in detail. First of all, you know how you're able to summon Spirit Ashes for boss fights? Well, turns out Commander O'Neill is able to do that too, as he's able to call up multiple ghostly exile soldiers during the fight. I actually like the whole idea of this, and I like the idea of the boss being able to call in reinforcements. After all, it fits his title of being, well, Commander O'Neill. However, I feel like the way that they implemented it into the fight was shitty, to say the least. The exile soldiers that Commander O'Neill summons thankfully don't have a huge amount of health, however they're also able to fire at you from range with various attacks, which can get pretty annoying if you're already trying to deal with a bunch of them at once. And aside from that, they don't really have any other role in the fight, they're just mild inconveniences while they're alive and you forget about them right after you kill them, so yeah. Aside from that, the uneven terrain of the arena can make dodging the boss's moves feel pretty irritating at times. Aside from that, the boss's moveset is almost the same as Commander Neil, however there is one big difference between the two. Can you take a guess what it is? Well, I'll tell you. It's just 2 words. Scarlet Rot. Yeah, that's right. Instead of giving Commander O'Neill some completely cool and unique moves separate from Commander Neil, they just decided to give a bunch of his attacks Scarlet Rot, which is basically the equivalent of Toxic from Dark Souls 3. And trust me, if you don't go into this fight with any preserving boluses, you're basically fucked as soon as it fully builds up. So yeah, surprisingly, I don't enjoy getting fucked over by a bunch of Scarlet Rot like Melania's little twink, hence why I decided to put this fight at number 39 on the list. Although thankfully, that's all the bad bosses in the game on this list. The next 2 are mediocre, but not really bad or anything. Number 38, Estelle, Natural Born of the Void. For me, Estelle is a boss that I really liked at first, but I've started to like less and less over time. I will say though that even though he is in the mediocre tier of bosses, he is by far the most relieved I've ever been to have encountered a mediocre boss fight. Mainly because you find this thing at the end of the Lake of Rot, which is by far the worst legacy dungeon in all of Elden Ring. Seriously, fuck the Lake of Rot, there is nothing good about it. But my hatred for the Lake of Rot aside, there are still some things that I actually do really like about Estelle. Mainly the presentation and atmosphere of the fight. Estelle has what I genuinely believe to be some of the best visuals out of any boss in all of Elden Ring. The arena you find Estelle in, that being a small cavern filled with a bunch of shallow water as well as an eternal night sky hovering over it, is absolutely gorgeous. And the design of Estelle itself not only looks beautiful, but also has a really Lovecraftian and grotesque feel to it, almost like some sort of cosmic horror in a way. It almost feels kind of like a boss that belongs in Bloodborne more than Elden Ring. Along with all of that, the lore behind Estelle is both vague but also very interesting, with the item description of his remembrance saying, quote, "Remembrance of Estelle, natural born of the void, hewn into the Erd tree. The power of its namesake can be unlocked by the finger reader, alternatively it can be used to gain a great bounty of runes. A malformed star born in the lightless void far away, once destroyed an eternal city and took away their sky, a falling star of ill omen." This tiny little bit of lore given to Estelle might not seem like much to the average person, however for me, I think it honestly really elevates the whole vibe of the fight. This extra bit of lore really makes me feel like I'm going up against some otherworldly, powerful, dangerous being, one that wants me dead, and along with that, it adds a lot to how unsettling the fight is for me, and adds a feeling of dread as well. Really, I could gush for days about how much I love the presentation of this fight. However, good presentation isn't the only thing that makes a good boss, because in my opinion, having a fun boss is the most important thing to making the fight good above all else. And unfortunately, when it comes to Estelle's gameplay, that's where the boss kinda falls flat on its face. In terms of gameplay, the fight isn't really all that bad, but it's also nothing really all that special either. During Phase 1, there is a single attack that I think is actually pretty cool, and that's this move where he swipes his arm and a nebula cloud follows behind him. And after a short delay, the nebula cloud will explode, so you have to be careful when dodging and mind your positioning. It almost kind of reminds me of Slave Knight Gale and how his attacks worked back in Dark Souls 3, where his cloak would follow all of his sword swings, which would incentivize more patience when dodging. But then again, maybe I'm doing Gale a bit of a disservice because I'm comparing a mediocre tier boss to him when he is by far one of the best bosses I've ever fought in a video game, and is easily the best boss in the Dark Souls trilogy. I'm sorry, I'm a simp for this fight, okay? Don't blame me, okay? It's fun. And I'm sorry, Gale, for comparing a mediocre boss to you. I'm sorry. Aside from that one move, most of Estelle's moves in Phase 1 feel kinda standard. There's some attacks where he fires at you from range, he uses some gravity magic, he can hit you with his tail from a distance, and he can also try attacking you with his pincers if you get too close. There is still something noteworthy about these attacks, though. All of them are very strangely timed and delayed in kind of a weird way, which I actually like. There is one attack in the first phase that I don't really like all that much, though. It's this AoE attack where he raises you above the ground only to slam you back down very quickly, dealing a good bit of damage. The attack looks really cool, but the thing is, there are some major flaws with it. My main problem with it isn't really how it's telegraphed, because it's telegraphed pretty decently. My issue is that it has too much range for the amount of time you're given to run away from it. So if you end up getting caught in it, a lot of the time it just feels really cheap. Estelle also has another move where he slams his arms down into the ground and creates shockwaves that come out after certain delays. I haven't really found a super consistent strategy when it comes to dodging all of the shockwaves other than just mashing the dodge button away from them and getting lucky. However, I won't hold it against Estelle because honestly, I think that's probably just a skill issue on my part and not really a fault of the boss itself. Look man, I said that I was a fan of Elden Ring. I never said that I was actually good at the game, so hey, please don't hold it against me. I know I'm not very good. Estelle also has the ability to teleport around the arena, which I actually do think is a bit of an interesting mechanic, and thankfully they didn't make the arena too large so that it became tedious to have to run after him, so I appreciate that. I know that Estelle has a grab attack that he can do, but I'll be completely honest, I don't really remember what exactly it does once you get grabbed by him because I don't think I've gotten grabbed by him in a very long time. Once you get Estelle below a certain health threshold, he actually does gain a new attack, which for once I think is actually really good. The attack basically involves him summoning a bunch of meteors through portals which come and fall down on you, which not only looks really cool, but is actually really fun and tough to avoid, which I really like. But that one new really good move added to his moveset doesn't really redeem the whole fight, not by a good bit because, well, his moveset is one of my main issues with the fight. Most of his attacks just feel way too samey. Pretty much all of them just feel like really big explosions, AoEs, and grabs, which on my first playthrough was really cool, but over time it's gotten really repetitive and dull. On a first attempt of the boss, all of his attacks feel really tricky to avoid and it can feel a bit challenging, but on a second attempt, pretty much all of the tells for his attacks become blatantly obvious, and once that ends up happening, I end up just getting left with a feeling of, meh, okay, whenever I've beaten him. So aside from being blown away by the visuals and atmosphere, I'm just not really enjoying myself all that much when fighting Estelle. I will say, I really do like just how unique this boss fight is. I don't think I've ever really seen anything quite like it before, and I really like it. It feels super original, actually. Is what I would have said on my first playthrough, but right in the middle of the Yellow Annex tunnel in the consecrated snowfield, well... Are you fucking You know what? I'm done. I'm done. This YouTube job, I'm done with this YouTube job. You know what? I'll just get somebody else to do this narration. Oh my, I can't believe they're stupid. I'm done. I'm out of here. Bye. Okay, I'm back at my desk with my microphone. I apologize for that little outburst I had. I was just royally pissed off because, well, as you can see in the footage here, they took Estelle and copy-pasted him into some random mini-dungeon in the middle of nowhere. Like, seriously, of all the bosses you could have reused, why did you go with a major boss in the game that was thought to be one of a kind? Seriously, this just... it baffles me. And now the fight with Estelle from earlier and all the atmosphere and stuff I was praising before feels much less special. If they didn't have this repeat of Estelle in the game, I would have put the original fight all the way up in OK tier. Not good tier, but OK tier. But well, since they reused him, I've gotta put him in the mediocre tier. Oh my god. And now at number 37, we have Magma Worm Makar. I know that the segment right before this one, the one on Estelle, was pretty long, but don't worry, this one shouldn't be quite as long because, well, there's not really as much to this boss. Do you guys remember Dark Eater Midir? You know, like that optional dragon boss from the Ring City DLC for Dark Souls 3? Yeah, pretty amazing boss, right? Well, now imagine if he kept spamming his Phase 2 charge attack over and over again. That's pretty much what fighting Magma Worm Makar is like most of the time. I could just leave it at that, but, well, you came here for my full commentary, so I'll give it. Magma Worm Makar is the boss found at the end of the Ruin-Strewn Precipice, which is a fairly short, fairly flawed dungeon, but still a really good one in my opinion. However, it also brings me to my first major issue with this boss, that being that Magma Worm Makar just feels really out of place. Most of Makar's moves revolve around fire and, well, magma, seeing as he's called Magma Worm Makar. Now, this is all fine and dandy, but the thing is, the dungeon leading up to him has absolutely nothing to do with any of this at all. Adding further onto this, the region that both the Ruin-Strewn Precipice and Makar are found in is Liurnia of the Lakes, which is a region largely dominated by a giant lake and is heavily themed around magic. So no matter which way you look at it, Magma Worm Makar being put here just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Along with that as well, Magma Worm Makar isn't even the only magma worm in the game because, well, magma worms are actually a fairly common mini-boss in Elden Ring. However, since Makar is placed at a pretty major point in the game, one of the entrances to the Altus Plateau, and since he does have a fair amount of differences between him and the rest of his siblings, I figured he was qualified to make the list. And also since you get an achievement upon killing him. I feel like if Makar had been put into a more fitting location, I'd appreciate him a good bit more, like let's say maybe if they put him somewhere on Mount Gelmir. That region has a pretty heavy volcanic theme to it, and also has a fairly hostile atmosphere, and I think Makar would fit right in over there. And plus, I feel like Mount Gelmir could use more content anyway. Makar will often spew out a ton of lava throughout the entire fight, which stays on the ground for a little bit, likely inspired by the Chaos Witch Quelaag from Dark Souls 1. In that fight, the lava worked extremely well and helped incentivize more careful positioning, which made the fight more tense and exciting. Not here, though. The most it ever ends up being here is just really obnoxious because of the way Magma Worm Makar constantly moves around. He's also got a charge attack that he loves to spam over and over again, which basically turns his whole body into damage on contact. Aside from those two moves, the rest of Magma Worm Makar's moveset is fine? I mean, I can't really think of anything particularly bad about the rest of his attacks, but I can't really think of anything outstanding about them either. He also just doesn't really interact that well with the arena, in my opinion. He feels almost kinda like a filler boss, like they designed the arena but didn't know what to put in it, so they just smacked Makar down and called it a day. Really, the only thing threatening about Makar is just the way he messes with the camera, and that's it really. All of his attacks are extremely telegraphed and pretty simple to avoid. When you get him below a certain health threshold, he buffs his sword up with some fire, which I do think is a little interesting, but it doesn't really change up the fight all that much. So overall, I can't really say that I dislike Makar, but I also can't really say that I like him either, so I decided to put him in the mediocre tier at the number 37 spot on the list. Thankfully though, that's all of the awful, bad, and mediocre bosses covered. We'll start out with the bosses that are okay, then we'll move on to some of the good bosses, the great bosses, and then the plethora of legendary bosses that exist within Elden Ring. Number 36, Jori Elder Inquisitor. Or is it pronounced Yori? Look, I don't know. I'm going with... either one works for me. Jory is a boss from the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, and I'll be honest, I wasn't originally going to include him in this list. However, I realize that he is kind of important, seeing as, you know, he guards the one and only entrance to the Abyssal Woods region, which means that you can only access one of the major open world regions within the Realm of Shadow if you fight this boss, so because of that, I decided that Jory was important enough to include on the list. One other thing I will say, technically Jory is just a buffed up version of one of the Horn-Sent Inquisitor enemies, however I feel like they're uncommon enough for me to be fine with them being used as a boss. Phase 1 is pretty unremarkable as it pretty much plays the exact same as if you were fighting a regular Horn-Sent Inquisitor, with Jory having access to all of the same spells and such. However, it's in Phase 2 where things actually get pretty interesting. In Phase 2, Jory gains the ability to summon other Horn-Sent Inquisitors, both the normal variants as well as the big fat ones. On paper, this sounds like a bit of a nightmare, however the Phantoms are pretty easy to take out as they die in just one hit, so it's not really unbalanced or anything. And I know for a fact that they die in one hit because even when I've had my Shadow Tree Blessing at a pretty low level, they've still died instantly when I hit them. I think Jory's whole gimmick of being able to summon Phantoms to fight you is really interesting and cool, and along with that, I feel like the Phantoms all work together really well. But, well, when we're comparing Jory to much more fleshed out bosses with full cutscenes, dialogue, and much more expanded movesets, as well as a lot more uniqueness to them, I just can't put him any higher than number 36. Number 35, Regal Ancestor Spirit. Before I begin my actual commentary on the boss, I want to mention that while I do realize that the regular Ancestor Spirit is a different fight than the Regal Ancestor Spirit, both of them pretty much feel like the same fight either way, so I decided to include them both in this entry. Is it kinda cheating? Yeah, but who really cares anyway? I feel like almost all of the good things I have to say about the Ancestor Spirit and Regal Ancestor Spirit could be followed up with at the time. It was really cool finding these bosses at the bottom of the Shifa River, at the time. The whole atmosphere of the fights and the visuals that accompanied them felt very new and fresh at the time. Their designs were unlike any other boss I had seen in the game, at the time. And I didn't really mind their movesets because I felt like the atmosphere immersed me more than anything, at the time. But as I've replayed the game more and more, the whole novelty factor behind the atmosphere and visuals of both of these bosses has kinda faded over time. Their movesets, while they aren't particularly bad, aren't really anything to write home about either. Nearly all of their attacks are exactly what you'd expect from a fight in this style. The only attacks in the first phase of the fight that feel like there's something unique and different are the moves where it breathes some sort of glowing fire at you, as well as when it starts leaping up in the air, which is pretty nice. All of its other attacks are pretty much just the same affair of thrashing, ramming, and stomping that you'd expect from a boss designed like this. Thankfully though, the Regal Ancestor Spirit actually does have a second phase, which changes things up a little bit. Although unfortunately, it still doesn't add a whole lot to the fight. The only thing that really changes in the second phase is just that the Regal Ancestor Spirit is able to teleport around the arena now, and it also has an AoE where it's able to heal itself. But even so, its attacks are way too predictable, and along with that, it just doesn't have enough health, plain and simple. However, all the things I liked about this boss at the time were still really good at the time though, and that's definitely not nothing. This boss was a B tier on my first ever playthrough, became a D tier on subsequent playthroughs, so in my opinion it all evens out at about a C tier. It's an okay boss fight. Sliding right on in at number 34, we've got the Red Wolf of Radagon. The Red Wolf of Radagon pretty much acts as the midway boss for the Academy of Rhea Lucaria, which I don't really mind, but I do have one complaint about it that I do have to get out of the way first. That being that the boss feels, how should I put this, unoriginal as fuck. Like, it feels like if they took Sif the Great Grey Wolf from Dark Souls 1 and sold him on Wish.com for $5. I've gotta be honest with you all. With that said, while Discount Sif isn't quite as good as the original Sif himself, I do find him to be a decent amount of fun to fight. The large amount of agility the boss possesses, as well as the fast and aggressive nature of his moveset, makes for a pretty fun challenge in my opinion. Unfortunately though, it's not really all that much of a challenge. Don't get me wrong, I don't think a boss needs to be super duper uber hard to be fun, but this fight feels a bit too easy for me, and that's the main Achilles heel for it. His moveset doesn't really have a huge amount of variety with it, as it mostly boils down to him swinging his sword around, biting, and using magic attacks, and that's pretty much it. I'm not expecting some sort of crazy, intense, incredible fight. After all, this is meant to be more of the mid-boss of the Legacy dungeon it's in than anything else, but still, I wish it had a more varied moveset. Then there's the other major issue with this fight, that being that the Red Wolf of Radagon just doesn't really feel like it belongs in the Legacy dungeon it was put into. The Academy of Raya Lucaria is a phenomenal location, don't get me wrong, however most of its theming revolves around blue magic. But the only thing about Discount Sif that even slightly relates to magic are the handful of magic attacks it'll use during the fight. Then there's the question of why we're even finding this wolf here. I mean, I know that Radagon himself was once married to Queen Renala, who is the main boss of Raya Lucaria, so I guess it makes sense to see some of his influence in the area, but I feel like this was just a really strange way to go about it. But either way, even with Discount Sif's flaws, I do still find it to be a kinda fun boss fight, hence why I decided to put it at number 34. And coming in at number 33, we've got Commander Gaius. Now we've finally moved on from the mediocre and okay tier bosses, and now we're getting into the bosses that are actually pretty good in my opinion. Commander Gaius is one of the Remembrance bosses from the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, and out of all of them, he's definitely my least favorite. However, that does not mean he's a bad fight by any means at all. Before I begin praising him though, I definitely want to get the worst aspect of this fight out of the way first, which is not only the worst part of the fight, but also by far the most infamous. That being his damn charge attack. Seriously, look at it. It's been like a month since the DLC first released, and to this day, I still have not found a consistent way to be able to dodge this attack other than just mashing the dodge button and getting lucky. Combining big damage and big hitboxes on an attack that's nearly impossible to avoid already is a recipe for disaster, and I'll be honest, I really don't know what the developers were thinking when they designed that move. The rest of his moveset, though, is actually pretty good in my opinion. Gaius has a combination of a bunch of thrusting as well as swinging attacks with his weapon, and along with that he has thrashing attacks from the boar he's riding, which makes for an interesting combo for sure. Sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to predict what his next move is going to be, however all of his attacks are telegraphed in a fair and well thought out way in my opinion. But Commander Gaius isn't just a melee-focused boss, as he also has access to a bunch of ranged attacks in the form of gravity magic he can use during the fight. The spells where he slings rocks at you, as well as the spells where he thrusts a bit of magic in your direction, all feel pretty good, and I don't really have any issues with them. The only spell from him that I really have a bit of a problem with is the gravity well that he creates occasionally, but even then it's not really all that big a deal. Once you get Commander Gaius below a certain threshold of health, that's when he mostly switches over to using magic-based attacks. However, I'm hesitant to call it a full second phase. Most of his spells, though, aren't really unique to this fight all that much, and many of them, like the magic orbs he summons that pull you in, are actually found in other boss fights too. However, I've neglected so far to mention my absolute favorite part of this fight. That being that you're actually able to ride Torrent in this fight, just like how Commander Gaius is riding his boar. Fighting Commander Gaius while on horseback just feels incredible in my opinion. It really makes you feel like you're in some sort of medieval jousting match, which I really like. And I never really thought we'd actually be able to see a successful Albinauric in Elden Ring, and I really appreciate that we actually got to fight an Albinauric who was successful. I will say though, I do think it's a little strange that they chose to make Commander Gaius a Remembrance boss. As far as Remembrance bosses go, he doesn't really look or feel all that unique, and along with that, he's the only Remembrance boss in the entire game to not have his own boss theme. Instead, he just uses an already existing battle theme in the game for his boss theme. But even with all his flaws, I do still think that Commander Gaius is a really good boss fight, hence why I decided to put him at number 33 on the list. And at number 32, we've got the Leonine Misbegotten. The Leonine Misbegotten is the boss of Castle Morn, found in the Weeping Peninsula, and is likely to be one of the first bosses that the player will encounter on their playthrough. The Leonine Misbegotten isn't really a tutorial boss, however, in my opinion it serves a pretty similar function of one, that being helping the player understand the flow of combat more. When it comes to teaching the player the flow of combat, that's where the Leonine Misbegotten does a great job in my opinion. It has just the right level of aggression for a first-time player, and along with that, its attacks are slow and telegraphed enough for a player to be able to get used to dodging them. However, its attacks also have just enough of a delay to them to punish people who have bad dodge timing to help the player get used to dodging boss attacks. The boss does a great job at helping the player get a feel for combat, and along with that, I just really love the way this thing attacks. I don't know why, I just really like it. Despite its beastly appearance, the Leonine Misbegotten moves in a way with its sword that's graceful and agile, and I just really like that. The way it just leaps and glides around the arena is just incredible in my opinion, and adds a lot to the pacing of this fight in my eyes. It almost kind of reminds me of Gale from Dark Souls 3. Unlike Gale though, the Leonine Misbegotten only really has one phase to the fight, which is a little bit of a shame because I feel like if they added a faster paced second phase to the fight, it would help out newer players even more, but that's just more of a nitpick than anything else really. I also just think the whole tense atmosphere of this fight is really well done, and while the Leonine Misbegotten does just use a generic battle theme, I think the specific one they chose fits really well here. The arena itself also adds a lot to this atmosphere in my opinion, with how it's covered in giant gravestones. Obviously the Leonine Misbegotten becomes really easy on repeat playthroughs, but I can forgive that seeing as it's one of the first bosses in the entire game. But then there's the part of this fight that honestly makes me a little bit sad. The Leonine Misbegotten is not unique, like, at all. In fact, towards the halfway point of the game, you actually begin encountering other Leonine Misbegotten as regular enemies, which was a little bit disappointing, I can't lie. I get that bringing back earlier bosses as just regular enemies to show you how far you've come on your journey is a classic RPG trope, but since this was one of the bosses given its own little dungeon as well as an achievement upon killing it, I was a little bit disappointed. But either way, the Leonine Misbegotten does a really good job helping the players get used to Elden Ring's flow of combat, and along with that, even if the fight is pretty easy on repeat playthroughs, it's still a good amount of fun, hence why I decided to put it at number 32. Number 31, the Apparition of Godfrey. This boss serves as like the midway boss for Leyndell, the royal capital, and along with that, it's kind of like a tease for the boss fight against the real Godfrey towards the end of the game, so this segment is likely going to be pretty short. But anyway, since the Apparition of Godfrey is meant to be like a tease for the boss fight against the real Godfrey later on in the game, they're obviously going to have pretty similar movesets. And for fairly obvious reasons, the moveset of the Apparition is far more limited than that of the man himself, which makes sense. The Apparition's moveset pretty much consists of the same deliberate axe swings as well as his stomps which summons Earth in front of him. These stomps, I believe, are meant to encourage you to roll into his attacks, however, I definitely forgot about that in the footage for this video. Yeah, I'm never gonna live this down, am I? His attacks chain together really well in my opinion, and it always feels super satisfying to get the rhythm down. However, for very understandable reasons, this boss is far outshined by the actual fight against Godfrey at the end of the game. And along with that, it's also outshined by the fight against Morgott, which comes right after this boss fight. But even still, I do find this to be a fun boss, hence why I decided to put it at number 31 on the list. Number 30, Elemer of the Briar. I'll be completely honest with you all, most of the time I end up just completely forgetting that this boss exists. However, I don't think it's a bad fight by any means. If anything, I think it's more just the result of the developers deciding to throw this boss inside a random castle in the Altus Plateau that I end up forgetting exists most of the time. Most of the boss's moveset is pretty standard, consisting of the usual sword swings, occasional thrusts, and the occasional shield ram that he'll do. However, there is one trick the boss has up its sleeve. Yes, it may make the boss a bit of a one-trick pony, however, thankfully for us, that trick is awesome. You see, when you're fighting Elmer of the Briar, his moveset is pretty standard when you're up close and personal with him. However, if you get at a distance, he's actually able to extend his sword out telepathically and swing at you from a distance as well. He's also got a signature corkscrew attack which will ruin your HP if you get hit by it. This means that the best strategy for taking on Elmer of the Briar is to remain up close and personal with him and avoid spam rolling. And if you keep this strategy up for a little bit, you'll pretty much be guaranteed to win, seeing as Elmer of the Briar doesn't really have a ton of health. Other than that, though, I just don't really have all that much to say about Elmer of the Briar, seeing as, well, he's pretty insignificant. He doesn't really have a ton of lore related to him, and the presentation is just alright in my opinion. However, while the boss fight may also be pretty easy, I do find it to be quite fun, hence why I put it at number 30. Coming in at number 29, we have the Dragonkin Soldier of Noxtella. Weirdly enough, despite the name, you don't actually fight the Dragonkin Soldier of Noxtella within Noxtella itself, rather you fight it outside of Noxtella at the end of the ant tunnels in the Ainsel River. Now, the Dragonkin Soldier of Noxtella is pretty much just a beefed up Dragonkin Soldier, however they're already pretty rare as they're only really encountered in a select few places in the game. Including in the Lake of Rot. Seriously, fuck the one in the Lake of Rot, that thing sucks. But anyway, rant aside, the Dragonkin Soldier of Noxtella is a surprisingly pretty good boss fight in my opinion. In the first phase, it pretty much has the same moveset as all the other Dragonkin Soldiers, consisting of arm slams and swipes, which must be avoided. The best strategy is to get as close as you can to the Dragonkin Soldier of Noxtella to be able to avoid most of these attacks and deal damage. The attacks can have a bit of a weird timing to them, however they're telegraphed in a way that lets you know they're coming, even if it can be sometimes tricky to get the dodge timing down. You'll want to avoid passivity in this fight, and you'll want to attack whenever you're given the chance to, that way you can potentially break its stance and be able to get a critical hit in. Once you get the boss below half health though, it'll actually enter into its second phase, where it sports a new pair of wings and along with that gains several new attacks involving lightning. However, this lightning is not like normal lightning, as it'll actually inflict frostbite on you if you get hit by it. Whenever he throws his lightning bolts, it creates a trail on the ground that'll erupt after a few seconds, which incentivizes careful positioning as well as good dodge timing. Unfortunately though, the fight isn't likely to last very long as the boss doesn't really have all that much health, which is a bit of a shame. However, the fight does still manage to be somewhat challenging, and because of it still being pretty enjoyable to me, I decided to put it at number 29 on the list. You know what? I'm not going to introduce this next boss myself. If you've watched my previous boss ranking videos, you probably know why. But if not, then well, just grab your popcorn and watch.
Hush, little Calva. I'll soon birth thee anew, a sweeting, fresh and pure.
Yep, at number 28 we've got Renala, the Queen of the Full Moon. That's right, one of the Shardbearer boss fights finally makes the list, with Renala in particular guarding the Great Rune of the Unborn. Out of all the Shardbearers, Renala is definitely my least favorite of them, but that's definitely not saying very much since she's still a pretty solid boss in my opinion. The first part of Renala's boss fight plays very similarly to the Deacons of the Deep from Dark Souls 3, however, I like this one a little bit more myself. Renala spends most of the boss fight hovering above the ground in a golden barrier that protects her from all damage. However, there is a way to dispel the barrier. When she creates the barrier, one of the juvenile scholars in the arena will start glowing gold, and if you run up to it and kill it, then the barrier will start to crack and the gold is transferred onto another one. Repeat the process a few times, and the barrier will eventually be completely broken, and Renala will now be vulnerable to your attacks. However, the barrier only stays broken for a limited amount of time, meaning you have to stack as much damage as you can while the barrier is broken in order to avoid having to repeat the process of killing all the scholars. And even aside from that, the scholars are actually able to fight back against you by throwing various objects at you as well as raining fire down from the ceiling and spewing fire in your direction. All of this makes for a pretty chaotic fight, and you'll have to be careful on where you're going as you're running around trying to find the correct scholar to kill. Everything I've mentioned so far would make for a fight that, while decent, wouldn't be anything to write home about. However, once you've seemingly killed Renala, that's when the real fight begins.
My beloved, have no fear. I will hold thee. Patience. Ye will be countless born, forever and ever. Upon my name as Rani the Witch. Mother's rich slumber shall not be disturbed by thee. Foul trespasser. Send word far and wide. Of the last queen of Caria, Renala of the Full Moon. And the majesty of the night she conjureth.
That's right, now Renala's boss fight has gone from a game of whack-a-mole involving a bunch of kids to an actual proper battle. Renala has an access to a wide amount of glintstone sorceries, including the Comet Azor spell which spews out like crazy and can deal a lot of damage if you get hit by it, the glintstone pebble which shows up much larger than usual and can be pretty devastating if you get hit by it, a couple of glintstone pebbles which she forms in an arc which then dart after the player in quick succession, and she can use her own staff as a weapon, being able to spin it around as well as throwing it after the player like a boomerang. Aside from all of that, she has her own unique sorcery she can use against you, where she'll summon a vision of the full moon which follows the player and then explodes after a couple of seconds, similar to the Flame of the Fell God from the Fire Giant fight. And even still, Renala has one other trick up her sleeve, that being she's able to summon other enemies during the fight, including Bloodhound Knights and Wolves. They disappear relatively quickly, but they can be pretty dangerous once they're summoned, but thankfully it seems that she's programmed to be less aggressive while they're active. Renala is absolutely at her most dangerous at a distance, and along with that, she'll be constantly moving away from the player during the fight, so your best bet is to try and get as close as possible to her and stack as much damage as you can. And all of this is neglecting to mention just how beautiful the arena is. Seriously, just take a look at it. Ugh. Oh my god, I swear, this arena is just nut-worthy. It's so beautiful. Unfortunately though, there's one very critical flaw with this boss fight, that being that it's just way too easy in my opinion. Renala has very low health, and along with that she barely has any poise to speak of, meaning it's pretty easy to just stunlock her into oblivion or stance break her constantly. If they gave her more health and more poise, I would have put this boss fight up in the great tier instead of with the good tier. However, for what it is, this still is a pretty enjoyable fight, so I decided to put it at number 28. Number 27, the Godskin Noble. The Godskin Noble pretty much acts as the midway boss of the Volcano Manor, which is a pretty good legacy dungeon, and in my opinion, the Godskin Noble as a boss is pretty underrated. Before I touch on the actual boss's gameplay, I will say that the arena looks really cool, and along with that, the design of the boss just looks kinda silly in my opinion. I'm not saying its design is good or bad, I'm just saying it looks kinda goofy with all the fat rolls and stuff. But even with the kinda goofy design, the Godskin Noble's threat level is definitely not a laughing matter. It wields the Godskin Stitcher, which is a large thrusting sword, and most of its attacks with it are, you guessed it, thrusting attacks, which come out pretty quickly despite its large size. The main strategy for avoiding his thrusting attacks is to dodge to the sides of them, however whenever he swings the Godskin Stitcher, you're supposed to either dodge into the attacks or away from them, as they'll cover a more broad area. The thrusting attacks with the weapon come out extremely quickly, whereas the swings are slower, but they hit hard and you have to make sure you avoid them. The Godskin Noble also has two Black Flame attacks he can use during the fight, the first of which summons pillars of Black Flame around him, meaning you have to be careful of your positioning, and the second is a ranged attack where he throws a raging ball of Black Flame at you. This Black Flame is extra dangerous because once it hits you, not only will it deal damage, but it'll also gradually deplete your health for a short amount of time, so you'll have to avoid these attacks whenever possible. And just like most bosses in Elden Ring, the Godskin Noble is quite aggressive, meaning you have to be defensive but also not be passive during the fight, attacking whenever you're given the opportunity, but also not being overly greedy with attacks. Learning his moveset is more straightforward than most bosses in the game, though, because he doesn't have as much of a delay to his attacks as other bosses. The music is also just top tier. Here, take a listen to it. The music just fits in perfectly with the fight in my opinion, and once you get the Godskin Noble down to half health, that's when he'll enter into his second phase. Unfortunately though, his second phase begins with what is by far the worst attack in his entire moveset. You know the one, it's the never-ending roll he does. And when I say never-ending, I mean it can go on for a long while. The hitbox is extremely big too, so iframing it is nearly impossible, and it seems like he'll go on until you're inevitably hit by it. There's some pillars in the arena that I think are meant to help out with this, but they aren't very useful from my experience. Aside from that one move though, he also gains another attack where he jumps up into the air and then slams back down with all his fat rolls. In order to avoid this attack, you're meant to actually jump instead of dodge roll, which I do really appreciate. He now also has the ability to do a belly thrust attack, although he barely does it from my experience anyway. Aside from this, the rest of Phase 2 is pretty much an even more aggressive and dangerous version of Phase 1, which means Spirit Ashes can definitely come in handy in Phase 2. And overall, besides the never-ending roll attack, the Godskin Noble feels really tough, but also really well balanced to fight against, and I really like this boss, hence why I decided to put it at number 27. Coming right on in at number 26, we've got Royal Knight Loretta and Loretta Knight of the Haligtree. So for this spot on the list, I'm technically cheating and putting two bosses in on the same spot. I understand that both Royal Knight Loretta and Loretta Knight of the Haligtree are both technically different fights. However, any differences between the two I definitely do not pick up on when it comes to gameplay. I understand that they're at different points in the game and all, but they both feel like the exact same fight to me, so I saw no reason to include them separately. But either way, both fights are still really solid in my opinion, and Loretta is definitely no joke of a foe. You first encounter her towards the early game at the end of Caria Manor, however, towards the end of the game you're able to find her again in Miquella's Haligtree. She's one of the bosses in the game to ride on horseback, and she wields Loretta's War Sickle, which is a type of halberd that's quite long and quite deadly. Her attacks don't have as much of a delay to them as other bosses, but they do still have a delay to them, meaning you have to pay attention when learning her attacks. And because of her halberd's length, her attacks have a lot of range to them, meaning that it's best to dodge into the attacks rather than away from them. But if you try abusing her size, you're probably going to end up getting kicked in the face by her horse, which heavily incentivizes patience. She's got a fair amount of aggression with her melee attacks as well, meaning you have to be, again, defensive but not passive with this boss fight, similar to most in the game. But if I were to pretend she was just a pure melee boss, I'd be a liar, because she has a lot, and I mean a lot of magic she can use to her advantage. She's able to fire glintstone shards from the end of her halberd, she's able to summon a bow and shoot arrows at you, she's able to use the Glintblade Phalanx spell, which creates a bunch of miniature daggers that'll home in on you, and she's also able to do a little something called Loretta's Slash, which can be quite deadly. And her Haligtree fight in particular, she's able to send out multiple glintstone shards at once at you, which can be quite dangerous. She's nothing super special visually or even gameplay-wise, but it's still a pretty enjoyable fight in my opinion, so I decided to put it at the top of good tier at number 26. And, well, under any other circumstances, I'd keep going with the list. However, unfortunately, this video is already like an hour and a half long, and along with that, WeVideo, my editing software, only lets me export videos that are 2 hours or less, so I'm gonna have to stop here. Trust me. I wish I could have my entire list in just one video, but I'm gonna have to split it into 2 parts. Sorry, guys. But hey, on a much more positive note, by the time I'm posting this, I'll have gotten over 400 subscribers, which seriously, thank you guys so much for that. I really do appreciate it. When I started this channel up again, since I abandoned this channel for a while after making my older videos, then came back to it last year, I first, just made my Bloodborne boss ranking, or, a review thing, just because I was really bored over summer break from school and wanted to do something that would be fun. I didn't think that a lot of people would actually really like what I have to say, and thank you guys for that, genuinely, it means a lot. Yeah, I don't, make my videos for the views, I just make them because, it's a fun hobby of mine, but, yeah, it's still wild to me that so many people actually care about what I have to say and what my opinions are. But, well, I decided that since so many of you subscribe to me and so many of you like watching my videos and hearing my opinions, you guys should at least have a face to attach to the name Gussie. So, yeah, this was not announced beforehand, I know, but you're gonna get a face reveal right now. I'm just gonna cut over to IRL Gussie, okay? Yeah, he'll do the rest of the outro for me. Hey there, everybody. It's me, IRL Gussie here, and in a very short couple of seconds, you're gonna get to see my face for the first time, and you'll see what I look like in the real world. But 3, 2, 1, bada bing, bada boom. Here I am. Yeah, maybe some of you expected me to look something like this. Maybe you didn't. I don't know. But yeah, this is I don't really know what to say. This is like my first time actually being on camera, like on this channel. But grass, you know, just some grass. I've touched grass. But yeah, here I am. Thank you guys for all the support, and I'll see you in part 2 of this. Part 2 of this list. So yeah, bye.